Vedanta Icon Cardiology Today and Tomorrow conference, which we do every year. And this Best of Cardiology series was supposed to have the 9th season this year. But because of unprecedented circumstances, I and Dr. Manish Bansal, we decided that we should go digital now because one doesn't know when there will be a face-to-face meeting. Interestingly, the meeting this time, and many of you may have actually received the brochures also, the theme was unraveling the complex clinical cardiovascular conundrum. And we have come a full circle because in this COVID pandemic, we are actually in a clinical cardiovascular conundrum. So welcome everyone to the World Heart Day 2020 and our Medanta Icon Cardiology Today and Tomorrow first digital meeting. The theme this year set by the World Heart Federation is use heart to beat cardiovascular disease. You remember last year, they said, my heart, your heart. This time it's gone even further to say, how can we help? Use heart to help beat cardiovascular disease. With these brief words, I would say that the times are unprecedented really. And there is stress everywhere, but there is also positivity everywhere. Look at doctors, COVID or non-COVID, people are on their jobs, people have not slept nights, people are looking after their specialties, taking full care about for themselves, their family, their staff, and also their patients. With these brief words, colleagues, let me introduce you to Dr. H.K. Chopra, my friend, colleague, and actually brother. We have traveled together in the field of cardiology for the last 35 years. He will chair this session. And Dr. Manish Bansal, whom we've been together for so many years, planning and actually doing things in the Medanta Heart Institute, that it makes me feel proud that I have good friends, good colleagues who stood by in the times of need. So Dr. HK, it is over to you. And thank you very much for finding out time.
Yeah.
I know how busy you are. I know how busy everyone is, but I'm really grateful that you found time to be with me and Dr. Manish. Thank you. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Ravi. I think it's always a great pleasure to be here and sharing a very prestigious session under the dynamic leadership of none other than my own friend, Dr. Ravi Kasliwal. Ladies and gentlemen, my alliance with Ravi almost goes to about 36, 37 years. And I love to work with him. I enjoy every moment of my life. When I work in academics, I remember this guy a lot. Ravi was the one who really helped me a lot when I took over the reins of CSI in the form of editor of Indian Heart Journal, as well as the president of CSI. They really helped me. Both Ravi and Manish, we work very, very closely. I feel very humbled and very honored that I'm associated with Dr. Ravi Kasliwal and Dr. Manish Bansal. How to introduce them? It's a very difficult task. It's a Herculean task. Both of them, Ravi and Manish, had a tremendous contribution in the cardiology, and they are the face of clinical, preventive cardiology and echocardiography in India to the world. As already mentioned by Ravi, that he's been doing the conferences almost every year. I used to go in almost every conference. I feel very honored and privileged for the same. The subject and theme this year on the occasion of World Heart Day, and you just heard Ravi talking on the theme of World Heart Day, is use your heart to beat CVD and use your heart to make preferential choices to have the healthy heart. But the theme of this meeting, the series which Ravi has started now, is the heart care in COVID pandemic. That's the theme of this presentation today. And we have a very important presentation. First presentation is by Dr. Manish Bansal on acute coronary syndrome in COVID-19. And then we have Ravi Kasliwal talking on COVID-19 and myocardium, from myocardium injury to healing. I think they are very, very important subject. Ladies and gentlemen, you all know that it is COVID-19 which hijacks the body right from the head to the toe. It is a pro-inflammatory and post-thrombotic, affect all the vessels right from the head to the toe. Similarly, it is pro-thrombotic, may cause pulmonary embolism, may cause acute coronary syndrome, acute MI, DVT, and stroke, and whatnot. I'm sure we are very eminent people to discuss on this subject, and then in the end, we'll have discussion, comments, suggestions, everything. With these few words, I request Dr. Manish Bansal, who will be talking on acute coronary syndrome in COVID-19. Dr. Manish Bansal, sir.
Yeah, so thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. It is indeed a great privilege for me to participate in this important symposium. And I thank Dr. Kasliwal for having created this platform and giving me this opportunity. As we know, and we are all experiencing this, COVID-19 has completely disrupted lives all around the world. And it has impacted humanity in a manner that nobody could have imagined even just a few months back. Today, 235 countries, areas, or territories in the world are affected. I believe it's going to be only North Korea which is not affected. Otherwise, every other country or region in the world has reported COVID-19 infection. We've had more than 33 million reported cases, nearly 1 million deaths. India is the second most affected nation in the world in terms of the total number of cases and the rate at which we are getting new infections. In 30-40 days time, we will leave behind US also to become the #1 country in the world in terms of total number of cases. The only saving grace for India has been the relatively low case fatality rate, because of which we have only roughly 1 lakh deaths so far compared to 60 lakh cases that we have had. Now, as we know, this infection is caused by a virus, which is novel beta coronavirus known as SARS coronavirus 2, which gains entry into human cells by binding to ACE2 receptors, which are situated in most abundance in lung tissues. And that is why lung is the primary target for infection and injury by this organism. Most of the symptoms related to this infection are also centered around lung diseases and lung injury. Cardiovascular system is the second most important site for infection by this virus, and therefore we have got significant cardiovascular complications also. As a cardiologist, we get involved in this infection in 3 different manners. First is that it is now well established that the patients who have pre-existing cardiac illness, they are at higher risk of having COVID-19 infection. And therefore, we come across patients who already had heart disease and have now presented with COVID-19, and we have to manage them. The second is that COVID-19 itself can lead to cardiac complications, as Dr. Chopra also mentioned briefly. But the biggest chunk of patients that we come across is this. The patients present with acute cardiac illnesses and their COVID status is not known. And then we are in a dilemma, how best to provide them acute cardiac care while also ensuring that we do not spread infection to ourselves, our colleagues, and to other patients in the hospital. And acute coronary event is a classical example of this predicament. In acute coronary event, there is urgency to intervene because time is muscle. We need to act fast. At the same time, if we are not aware of the COVID-19 status of the patient, then we are in a great trouble. How best to provide the appropriate treatment to the patient. And that is what I'm going to discuss in this presentation. So acute coronary event in COVID-19 can occur in 2 different ways. First is that plaque ruptures may happen because of inflammation and hemodynamic shear stress, which is produced by high output circulation, which is quite common in these patients. And second is that the patients who already have pre-existing obstructive coronary disease, which was asymptomatic, becomes clinically manifest because of increased oxygen demand of the myocardium due to tachycardia, hypoxia, and hypotension. So because of these two reasons, we come across acute coronary events in COVID-19. Now, when this pandemic broke out, initially everyone was bracing for rapid surge in the number of cardiac complications and patients with ACS. But as the initial few weeks passed by, a different trend emerged. Everywhere it was noticed that the number of STEMI cases presenting to the ER was decreasing. And this became talk of the town, so to say, and everywhere, in every journal and newspaper article or website, this was the point that was being discussed. And this was reported in numerous studies also. These are some of them reported right from US to several countries in the Europe, and we have a study from India also, which have shown that the number of acute coronary syndrome cases presenting to ER have gone down by 30 to 50% during this period. Different people have postulated different theories for that. Some believed that the low number of ACS cases were probably because patients were now at home and they were not exposed to stress related to their work, and maybe that is the reason why they were having less ACS. But that's not true. As we know, everyone is under greater amount of stress during this period in every way because of the fear of infection and financially in every sense. So low stress cannot be the reason. The actual reason has been the fear of getting infected by presenting to hospital, and that's why the patients have been hiding their symptoms. They are not seeking medical attention. And the lockdown, which was imposed by most of the governments, also contributed to it because it became difficult for the patients to present to the hospital. So this should have meant that the more patients were now dying at home. And in fact, this is exactly what was reported in this news article, which was published in early April in the US. And this article mentioned that the number of people dying at home in New York had increased by tenfold during this period, which very clearly tells us that the low number of ACS cases coming to hospital is purely because of patients not reporting their symptoms, and they were ending up dying at home because of the lack of care. So here comes a very important role for all of us. We need to educate our patients that ignoring their health is not a right thing to do. The risk of getting COVID-19 infection by coming to hospital is much, much lower than any risk that is there if their cardiac condition is not treated properly. This is a very recent study. It is still in press, not formally published in Indian Heart Journal. This is from Apollo Hospital, Chennai. In this study, the investigators looked at their data of new ACS cases during the period April-May this year, roughly 2 months, and they compared with the numbers with the numbers from the same period during 2019. What they found was that, as expected, number of ACS cases had decreased by 43% and STEMI by almost half. But more telling was this finding that the now time duration from symptom onset to hospital presentation had increased from 8 hours to 24 hours. Now, 8 hours itself is quite poor and something to be worried about as a country, but 24 hours is totally dismal. And this was then getting reflected in the mortality also. Within this brief period, there was 35% increase in mortality in these ACS patients, although this difference was not statistically significant because the numbers were small. But this basically highlights that what is happening because of the non-presentation by the patients to the hospital with their acute symptoms. Now, when patients present to the hospital with suspected ACS, many problems begin with that presentation itself. First is the diagnosis itself. As we know, myocardial injury is common, and Dr. Kasliwal is going to talk about this in detail. Rise in troponin alone does not mean acute coronary event in a COVID-19 patient. We need to correlate this troponin rise with the symptoms, ECG changes, and whenever echo is possible, wall motion abnormalities. And only when they match, we can label the patient as having ACS. But many times it is not possible to distinguish between ACS related myocardial injury and non-ACS related myocardial injury, and that creates a lot of confusion. If ECG does not show ST elevation, then problem becomes very difficult to address. But even when there is ST elevation, that also is not a guarantee that the patient has presented with acute MI. This series of 18 cases published from New York in NEJM in May-June period clearly highlights this. Dr. Sripal Bangalore and his group published these 18 cases of so-called STEMI by ECG diagnosis, and they found that only half of them had actual myocardial infarction, and the remaining 10, it was non-myocardial injury. But there were some important points to glean from this data. First is that the patients who had non-myocardial injury, none of them had regional wall motion abnormality on echo. On the other hand, most of the patients who had true myocardial infarction, they had evidence of regional wall motion abnormality. Also, patients who presented with STEMI, true STEMI, they had much higher troponin levels, much higher D-dimer levels. The interesting part about this was that the patients who had non-coronary myocardial injury, they actually had higher mortality as compared to those who had myocardial infarction. This is probably because ST elevation in the absence of coronary obstruction reflects more extensive myocardial damage, more extensive inflammation, and more severe disease. And that is the reason why presence of ST elevation on ECG in the absence of obstructive coronary artery disease is actually a worse sign of poor prognosis in these patients. But sometimes wall motion abnormalities can also occur in the absence of any obstructive disease. This is one example which I want to show. This was a 46-year-old lady. She did not have any comorbidities. She had fever with cough for 2 days, roughly 10 days ago, treated by a local GP, recovered completely. But then she had chest discomfort with shortness of breath, which lasted for 16 hours, and she presented to the hospital. At the time of presentation, her oxygen saturation was 90% on room air. Troponin was elevated, high sensitive, 1200 nanogram per liter, which will be equivalent to 1.2 nanogram per ml of the conventional troponin. D-dimer was slightly elevated. So troponin D-dimer was slightly elevated, so to say. This is her ECG. It shows subtle ST elevation in V1 to V3. There is no reciprocal ST depression. PR interval is markedly prolonged, as we can see, 280 milliseconds. So all these features are actually highly suggestive of COVID-19 infection, because we see bradycardia quite commonly. So the subtle ECG changes, not very high troponin and D-dimer, would indicate that this was probably non-MI related symptom presentation. But she also had significant regional wall motion abnormalities. LAD territory was completely akinetic. However, she turned out to be having normal coronaries. So this was probably a type of Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, which is also known to occur in COVID-19 patients. But by and large, significant regional wall motion abnormalities indicate the presence of true acute myocardial infarction in these patients. Now, once we diagnose or at least suspect ACS, the next is to decide about the next course of management and how we want to proceed, whether it's going to be conservative or invasive. And here the main goal of treatment is to balance the risk in terms of causing spreading infection to the hospital staff, healthcare workers, causing contamination of the hospital equipment and surroundings. And at the same time, we also have to ensure patient safety. We need to ensure that the patients end up having good clinical outcomes. Therefore, the guidelines recommend a risk-based approach Now, in non-ST elevation ACS, there are many patients who present with relatively low risk ACS, and there we have the option of delaying the invasive procedure by a few hours, during which time we can ascertain the COVID-19 status of the patient. But if the patient has come with hemodynamic instability, recurrent ongoing chest pain, life-threatening arrhythmias, mechanical complications, acute heart failure, or recurrent intermittent ST elevation. So these are the situations in which urgent invasive intervention is needed. Now, if the patient has presented to a hospital where facilities available for performing immediate invasive intervention by taking all safety precautions, then it's good for the patient that he or she will get proper care. But if the patient is presented to a hospital where these facilities are not available, then it's going to be a very difficult scenario. In other situations, we have some time, we have to initiate the acute management, and then we can test for COVID-19 infection, and depending on the test report, further action is taken. In contrast, in STEMI, we do not have such liberty or luxury. STEMI is emergency in which immediate reperfusion is the most important goal of management. For reperfusion, primary PCI there's no doubt that primary PCI is the preferred mode of reperfusion. It is highly efficacious compared to fibrinolysis, and therefore the major guidelines emphasize on doing primary PCI in these patients. If the patient has presented to a hospital where immediate PCI facility is not available, then the guidelines recommend transferring the patient to a PCI center, provided there is no extra delay beyond 60 minutes. If the patient is already presented to a center where PCI facility is available, then PCI is the preferred approach. However, it must be ensured that first medical contact to reperfusion time is not more than 120 minutes. If it is becoming longer than that, then fibrinolysis should be performed because it will achieve rapid reperfusion. In India, we know primary PCI has very limited availability even during the routine course. So during COVID-19, it becomes even more difficult to make primary PCI available to most of these STEMI patients, and therefore the Indian guideline heavily emphasizes on fibrinolysis as the first choice treatment for patients presenting with STEMI. And this document actually also discourages inter-institutional transfer in order to avoid causing infection or spreading infection to others. So basically what the guidelines say that wherever the patient presents, if primary PCI facility is available and the hospital has necessary infrastructure to ensure safety precautions for the operators, then primary PCI to be done. In all other patients, we need to do fibrinolysis. However, fibrinolysis, as I mentioned, has limited efficacy compared to primary PCI. So that is one challenge. Number two problem with fibrinolysis is that in many of these COVID-19 patients, we are not sure of the diagnosis also, as I showed in previous slides. And therefore, if we are fibrinolizing the patient, we might end up fibrinolizing wrong patient. If we are doing primary PCI, then we have the opportunity to confirm the diagnosis also. And third, these patients are also at higher risk of having bleeding complications, because of which fibrinolysis becomes risky. So all these challenges are there, because of which the outcomes are not going to be as great as expected. This is highlighted in this very recent publication by Marco Roffi et al. In Circulation, which shows that there are delays right from the beginning, from patient symptom onset to presentation to the hospital. There are delays at the level of clinicians also, because initially there is reluctance and they need time to wear PPE and get ready. And then if there are issues related to fibrinolysis and primary PCI, I just mentioned, because of late presentation, primary PCI is not as effective as it would be in any other patient, and fibrinolysis has its own challenges. So the end result is we end up with patients who have more LV systolic dysfunction, more extensive infarctions, pump failure, high risk of ventricular arrhythmias, and mechanical complications. And this is being seen also, I'll show you. But as I mentioned, there are delays not only at the level of patient, but in the hospital also. This is one publication from Hong Kong, which is a highly developed country. So even there, when this pandemic broke out, the door to device time and cath lab arrival to device time increased significantly as compared to the pre-COVID period. So this delay has nothing to do with the patient hesitation. It is because of the hospital system not being prepared to handle these patients. And this is a very large publication from China. This study was published only a few weeks back. 30,000 STEMI patients who presented during the late 2019 to February 2020, roughly 2 months period, were included in this, and they were divided into two groups based on their geographic location: Hubei province, which was the epicenter of this infection, and non-Hubei. As we can see, once the outbreak occurred, number of patients presenting to hospital decreased, symptom onset to first medical contact time increased. In late January, Chinese government recommended that in Hubei province, most of the patients presenting with STEMI should be thrombolized. So there was significant dip in the number of primary PCI happening there, and thrombolysis numbers increased significantly. But more worrisome is this chart. As we can see, this I've already mentioned that primary PCI decreased and thrombolysis increased, but look at this: timely reperfusion decreased by roughly 20%, which was statistically significant. Mortality increased by 20%, heart failure increased by roughly 10%. All these were statistically significant differences. And because of this, we now need to become prepared for handling more patients with heart failure because of inadequate reperfusion or delayed reperfusion in STEMI and ACS, which is going to be a fallout of this pandemic. There are some management principles in these patients when they are undergoing primary PCI or any intervention. Nowadays, as we have very large numbers of new infections occurring in our country, we should treat every acutely ill patient as COVID positive, especially if the patient is being managed invasively. All relevant PPE should be used. We need to minimize use of equipment, minimize exposure to the patient, and post-procedure proper decontamination and sanitization is required to avoid causing infection to others. When the patients are undergoing primary PCI, complete revascularization should be done in one go to avoid staged procedures so that hospital stay is reduced. Even in patients who have relatively stable disease, we should try to discharge them early so that their hospital stay is reduced. And in patients who have borderline respiratory status, in them, when the patients are being shifted to cath lab, it is preferable to intubate them in the emergency room or ICU itself rather than doing that on the emergency basis in the cath lab, because intubation is an aerosol generation procedure and doing it in the cath lab would be detrimental. The drug doses remain same, whether it is fibrinolytic therapy, antiplatelets, or anticoagulants. There's no change, but we need to be cognizant of some drug interactions, like drugs such as lopinavir and ritonavir. They are strong inhibitors of CYP3A4 pathway in the liver, and because of this, they increase levels of apixaban, rivaroxaban, and vitamin K antagonists. So dabigatran is a better option if you have to use a DOAC. Heparins are all good. These agents also increase levels of ticagrelor and reduce effect of clopidogrel. So prasugrel may be a better P2 white cell inhibitor in these patients. And when we are using these patients, we also need to make sure that we are not using very high dose of statins, because statin levels are also increased. Azithromycin, which is a drug quite commonly used in these patients, also increases levels of apixaban, rivaroxaban, warfarin, and unfractionated heparin. So we need to be careful. We also need to be careful about QT prolongation, because many of these drugs that are used in these patients prolong QT. So to summarize, ACS management during COVID-19 presents several unique challenges, which include delayed presentations by the patients, There is a dilemma about urgency to intervene versus risk of spreading infection. There is a big issue of lack of adequate resources, infrastructure to provide proper care to these patients while also safeguarding the hospital personnel and hospital equipment. We also need to be careful about drug interactions. Therefore, in every patient who presents with ACS during this period, we need to use a risk-guided approach, striking a balance between personal safety and optimizing patient outcome is the main goal of management in each individual patient. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manish. I think it was a very brilliant presentation. And there is a total paradigm shift in the management approach, as you mentioned, showing the data all over the world, from China, from US, and from India. I think you've shown very beautiful algorithms. But there is a definite re-emergence of thrombolytic therapy in the era of COVID due to various reasons, I think Manish has mentioned. We'll have the discussion in the end. And with these few words, I will request our next speaker, Dr. Ravi Kasliwal, talking on a very important subject, COVID-19 and myocardium, from myocardial injury to healing. I think it's a very, very interesting talk. And I'll request Ravi to please have his presentation. Dr. Ravi Kasliwal, sir.
Thank you, sir. COVID-19 and myocardium, from myocardial injury to healing. Dr. Manish Bansal has very succinctly defined our problems as cardiologists, problems of the patients as when they come with a cardiac disease, and how do we go forward. So let me take it from a step further. So the background of coronavirus disease 2019 has already been defined, and it's undoubtedly one of the deadliest pandemics in modern history. And the mode of infection is direct entry of the virus into the cells, and this Dr. Bansal has said very, very clearly, which is predominant. So the direct entry of the virus into cells via human ACE2 receptors, which is predominantly in lungs, but also throughout the cardiovascular system. This slide has been shown many, many times, but if you look at it, it is this ACE2 which actually shown in is the initial entry of severe acute respiratory coronavirus into the cells, primarily ACE2 pneumocytes, after binding to its functional receptor, angiotensin converting enzyme 2. So this is the real, this thing with which the virus actually enters into the lungs. After endocytosis of the viral complex, surface ACE2 is further downregulated, resulting in unopposed angiotensin 2 accumulation. This is the key step in actually the virus getting into the lungs. Now, SARS-CoV-2 causing COVID-19 is the 7th coronavirus disease known to infect humans, in which 3 coronavirus outbreaks have been reported already in the 21st century. 2003 was SARS-CoV, which caused 774 deaths. Then 2012, you have MERS-CoV, and then 2019 has superseded the death toll of SARS and MERS many times over. And if you look at it, it has become, as of today, one of the biggest killers, or number one killer of worldwide. It's number one cause of death worldwide. And the same thing is seen here, shown here, the current situation in India. We started in March, April, and then slowly it built up. There is a flattening, but the numbers have been huge. It is important to understand, to realize the stages of COVID-19 infection, because what may appear as stage 1 to be early infection in which there are mild constitutional symptoms may definitely very quickly deteriorate to 2A and 2B, and then into stage 3, which is the hyperinflammation phase. The point is that many of the people who have very few symptoms to begin with actually have, with time course, shortness of breath and ARDS, and may actually not actually make it. So cardiovascular complications are the most common complications among hospitalized patients with COVID-19 and are associated with higher risk of in-hospital mortality. So myocardial injury is 7.2 to 40.9%. And strokes, acute heart failure, as Dr. Bansal has already said, pose a huge problem. And some of these things may not be realized actually. We've seen patients going away and then come back with acute heart failure or with myocardial injury. So what is myocardial injury? The fourth universal definition of myocardial infarction defines myocardial injury as a TN concentration above the 99th percentile of URL, but it can be, basically, it's acute injury or chronic injury as a result of mismatch between supply and demand. It can be acute non-ischemic myocardial injury, myocarditis, direct myocardial myocyte damage, sepsis, or stress cardiomyopathy. This picture actually depicts something very, very clearly, that those who have mild disease, those who have moderate disease, and those who have severe disease, you can see actually the incidence of myocardial injury in COVID-19 is gradually increasing. And those who have higher degrees, or those who are intubated, have higher chances of actually had myocardial injury. And the possible mechanisms of myocardial injury are manifold, but very clearly, if you look at hypoxia, metabolic demands, these include the oxygen supply and demand mismatch. This is actually what we call as type 2 diabetes, type 2 myocardial infarction. Oxygen supply demand mismatch, and this can cause an increase of HS troponin, and this can cause myocardial injury. So myocardial injury is totally separate from myocardial infarction, and that the fourth universal definition of MI has very clearly demonstrated. But here comes the catch, that in many patients, the epicardial plaque may be there in the patient already. It's just a plaque, but as a result of hypoxia, as a result of metabolic demands being high, as a result of continuing tachycardia, they may also actually have a myocardial infarction, and that is demonstrated, and that is shown here in one of those patients who had a plaque rupture and had a type 1 myocardial infarction. So these cardial injury by far and large, which is an oxygen supply demand mismatch, but we can also have an actual infarct as a result of this disease. So potential treatment strategies to minimize myocardial injury in hospitalized patients, what I thought was that truly direct invasion through ACE2, we can have viral protein neutralizing antibodies, ACE2 blocking antibodies, doesn't seem like so. Hypoxia and ischemic injury, oxygen therapy, hemodynamic support, abnormal coagulation and microcirculatory disturbances. You can have prophylactic anticoagulation, which people do anyway, and there can be a cytokine storm. So if you look at it, myocardial injury is not limited to just severe and critical patients. That is one question. Secondly, what are the long-term implications of this myocardial injury? Actually, one doesn't know. And are you healed once you have recovered? And that truly is what I have to speak about. COVID-19 myocardium, from myocardial injury to healing. This study of ours of 30 patients, initial 30 patients, our ongoing study of patients recovered from COVID-19 at Medanta Heart Institute, patients who presented back to hospital with cardiac symptoms were 30. Patients were aged between 27 and 70. 23% of the patients were female, had past history of cardiovascular disease prior to COVID-19. So many of the patients actually had no disease, no cardiovascular disease. One of the things that I found in our patients, and we are analyzing a far bigger data, is palpitations are very common. Sinus tachycardia is very common. Chest pains, dyspnea, of course, and undue fatigue. These are some of the presenting symptoms in these patients. When they came to cardiography, and we did use 2D echo with GLS, and many of the patients, and I'll show you one patient at least, where the GLS was abnormal. So, and they had Holter monitoring as and when required. They had complete troponin levels, height sensitive troponin levels, along with complete blood counts, kidney, liver function tests, and of course, chest x-rays. So our preliminary results show that a large majority had actually normal ECGs. Sinus tachycardia was seen in 20%. Supraventricular tachycardias were also seen as also sinus bradycardia, referred to by Dr. Manish Bansal. Echocardiographic changes and abnormalities in the remaining patients, we found a global LV dysfunction in 2%, normal LVAF with reduced GLS. This is emerging as one of the problems that may affect these patients later. But if we have a handle of this now, we can track them with far more sincerity. And of course, they can have normal LV systolic fraction. So what I have for you is a mixed bag. There are people who keep phoning me, even on the video, that they have increased heart rates, they're not feeling well, they have tachycardias, their echocardiographic evaluation is actually normal. Herein, I'm showing you a patient who's 32 years old, a COVID recovered patient. She had no past cardiac injury or history, but she continuously complained of palpitations. And with Holter, we defined that as sinus tachycardia. She had dyspnea. And you can see here very clearly that even though her global left ventricular function was normal, she actually had impaired global longitudinal strain, which was at -15. What are the possible implications of this? Only time will tell, because this disease is still an enigma. But definitely, more and more people are reporting problems in subendocardium as picked up by global longitudinal strain. So although the most virulent manifestations of COVID-19 is ARDS, many worldwide reports have demonstrated cardiac injury through elevation in troponin concentrations. Again, I repeat, every troponin concentration is not a myocardial infarction. Most likely cardiac injury, myocardial injury, or a type 2 MI. And of course, there are still large gaps in our current understanding of the underlying mechanisms by which this virus affects cardiovascular system and how such an involvement may alter clinical outcomes, and they may alter clinical outcomes greatly over a period of time. So Jack carried an article which was based on Mount Sinai hospitals in all across the state of New York, and they asked 3 unanswered questions. What is the range of troponin levels elevation across different populations based on history of CVD compared to those without CVD, and whether these troponin elevations represent infarction or injury, and what is the impact of myocardial injury in the context of the COVID infections. And this is what they came up with, and this is what we are seeing as well, that the blue are the hospitalization, D is the discharge, M is the mortality, and the mortality successively increases if the initial myocardial injury, if troponin levels are high. So does the troponin give you a handle of what's going to happen? Possibly. Troponins, 2D echocardiography, global longitudinal strain, all these can tell us. But this study was good in the sense that they said, what happens to people whose troponin levels are between less than 0.03, between 0.03 to 0.09, and above 0.09, the mortality was the highest. And same thing here, even milder forms of myocardial injury were associated with higher risk of death and less frequent discharge than troponin levels in the reference range. So these are important things that I think all over the world, cardiologists are getting into the mainstream of COVID treatment and trying to risk stratify patients to see how they can help. So COVID-19 therefore causes systemic inflammation with varying presentations of cardiac involvement. This is important, varying presentations of cardiac involvement. Although troponin elevation above 99th percentile is considered the central marker of myocardial injury, only few patients met this criteria for myocardial infarction as the 4th universal definition. And this is one definition from, this is one central diagram from the same article. And again, the outcomes are listed here. If you look at the mechanisms of myocardial injury, inflammation, cytokine storm, micro and microthrombi, direct viral invasions have been postulated, I think, one of the things that's very important is actually supply-demand imbalance, and that actually causes type 2 kind of a myocardial injury. So myocardial injury is prevalent, generally at low levels among patients with acute COVID-19 and is associated with worse outcomes. History of CVD was associated with myocardial injury in the setting of COVID-19 infections, and the results of this study suggest abnormal troponin concentrations. We are finding results almost akin to these findings. So when we look at, so this is one part, the myocardial injury part. But when we look at COVID patients who go home and then talk to you on the video, several things have come out, and which I would like to deal with the healing part: breathlessness, excessive tiredness, muscle aches, fever, palpitations I'm finding very commonly, chest discomfort, headaches, confusion, low moods, and insomnia. Many of these symptoms are echoed across by many other cardiologists who feel that patients have inordinate tachycardias. Healing post-recovery, I really don't know. But unlike conditions that have been known for decades, COVID-19 still stands as an enigma. And so all of us are learning that how we can help our patients heal better. What are the role of medications in healing? I've used beta blockers, and where the blood pressure didn't permit, I've used ivabradine, because in those patients who continuously complained of tachycardia, ACE, ARBs, and ERNI, if the patients were taking, we have not stopped them. Statins could have helped. And of course, there is a growing body of thought which says that omega-3 fatty acids can actually help. So all patients are advised to continue their previous medications in adequate doses with regular home monitoring of blood pressure and heart rate. Actually, at home today, you can actually have a heart station with a BP instrument, a ECG, and you can have a pulse ox, which will tell you oximetry and heart rate. These things are important to treat our patients at home because they're afraid to come. The role of diet in healing is immense. You can food items rich in minerals, omega-3 fatty acids, manganese, and antioxidants are supposed to be good. So green leafy vegetables, whole grains, whole wheats, oats, barley, fish and fish oil, garlic, and especially I would like to say that, you know, walnuts can be used because it's the only nut which has free, and also alpha-linoleic acid, the ALA, which others don't seem to have, because the disease is still unfurling, it's still unraveling. So we really don't know where it will go. So wherever we can help the patients in a non-invasive fashion by diets and yoga, we should do that. And omega-3 fatty acids, the ALA, walnuts are unique among them. They're primarily comprised of polyunsaturated fatty acids, and then only nut that's significantly high in omega-3. So the thing is that diet will play a very major role. Ancillary medication plays a definite role in this condition, and many of us follow the Predimed diet, and in the Predimed diets, Mediterranean diet are supplemented with mixed nuts, but 50% are walnuts, and the walnuts are the ones which give us a lot of ALA and things like that, which are helpful in this condition. Walnuts and heart health have been known for a while. Since 1933, researchers have been investigating how eating walnuts positively affects various heart health biomarkers and risk markers. And in this condition where patients are sitting at home, they do need something, and walnuts and heart health has been known for a while. Though this is not the primary thing that I have to speak about, but definitely I would like to re-emphasize the use of good diet, a wholesome diet, and walnuts would help. Role of exercise, you have to be very, very specific here that COVID-19 triggers an intense inflammatory reaction. So recovered patients are recommended to stay active, but you will have to see that exercise. You'll have to examine before you actually ask them to exercise in any way or form. But with patients with no history of cardiac injury, they should embrace a gradual return to physical activity before they go back to their pre-COVID-19 workouts. That is very, very clear. So there is, of course, role of mental health also in healing, healing thoughts, positive thinking. Yoga is an extremely good thing at this point. Breathing exercises and mind-body healing. And who better than Dr. Chopra to say a few words about these things? So I would end by saying that I think I've raised more queries than actually answers. But certainly I believe COVID-19 is not just a respiratory disease. I think myocardial injury is common in COVID-19 and may facilitate risk stratification of many patients, as has been done in at least 2 studies. Myocardial injury and cardiac complications are persisting in covered patients, and we'll have to see. We are there for long haul. We'll observe these patients over a long period of time and then come up with some guidelines. A complete cardiac checkup is advised for all survivors before they rejoin their pre-COVID schedule, because early diagnosis and proactive action can reduce or halt the inflammatory damage. How long the effects are likely to persist remains to be determined and needs further studies. So I would end by saying that the process of healing does not end when the wounds are no longer visible. Thank you, Dr. Chopra. Thank you, Dr. Bansal. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your patient hearing. I know I've raised more questions than answers, but then all of you are also seeing patients of this kind, and maybe we can all work together to come to a common consensus. Thank you very much. Dr. Bansal, would you like to say a few things? Please.
It was indeed a very good overview of various mechanisms of myocardial injury in COVID, something that we all dread about, and the ways to prevent it. Actually, that was a more important part of your talk, because we have been listening to various presentations, reading many articles that talk about how myocardial injury occurs and what the implications are, but very little discussion about how to regain the same health, how to recover that myocardium, and how to go towards healing. So that was a very, very important and informative part. Dr. Chopra has joined back, sir.
Oh, please, Dr. Chopra.
Many patients who are coming back after their COVID infection, they have many cardiac issues like palpitations and fatigue and dyspnea on minimal exertion, as you mentioned. During that period, psychological counseling is certainly important, but more important is to focus on good diet, gradual and monitored supervised exercise rehabilitation program. Both are equally important. Something which is being neglected completely.
No, I totally agree with you that it is not just the medical treatment, because actually we really don't know what's going to help them the most, but diet, exercise, and mental health, because some of them feel that maybe it's the end of the road for us.
Yes.
But yeah. And on the other hand are people who think, oh, now I've come to the hospital, now I can do anything.
Yes.
But gradually, I think people have to be told that along with physical health, along with yogic, simple exercises of deep breathing and a good diet, maybe their walnuts or their vegetable diets or their fish eating, whatever has to be done in a very well-balanced manner. And as you said, and you had telecardiology in our institute, telemedicine should be the backbone of it, that they should at every step come to at least ask a look. You know, like somebody asked me the other day, sir, I'm feeling well now, can I start with weights? I said, please, don't even think about it at this point. So I think right now people need. So Dr. H.K. Chopra is here now. Dr. H.K., we are all.
I think, ladies and gentlemen, there was some disconnectivity. I would just like to mention that the first talk given by Dr. Manish Bansal was an outstanding talk. They have just reviewed the whole data. And I think we had a myth initially that the prevalence of ACS has come down in COVID is shown very clearly. It's all because of lockdown. The fear was the second part. Lockdown was a major part, which was shown today in the CSI meeting also. It was a major cause, and I think he explained it. And the mortality was relatively very, very high. And there is definitely re-emergence of thrombolytic therapy for various reasons. I remember the data of CSI, NIC Council, which I mentioned, that only 20% of our patients are able to get primary PCI. I don't talk of urban areas, semi-urban areas or rural areas. And I think Dr. Manish has shown very rightly that the gold standard is still primary PCI. But a patient who had an acute MI, especially large anterior wall MI with malignant tachyarrhythmias, hemodynamically unstable patient, or a patient who is in cardiogenic shock or on mechanical device, they are the people who have to be taken to the cath lab wherever they are. And they are the people for primary PCI. But otherwise, the other patients who are ACS, they can be the candidates where we can give fibrinolytic agent. And I think the data is emerging out. We still not so mature to have a large data, but whatever is shown is very nice. I remember in March 19, Ravi was a part of it. We launched Mission Attack Heart Attack. And I think a time has come. Common man is to understand that heart attack is a very, very important denominator, which every part of public should also know. Like Manish has mentioned, we should not waste our time. Time is a muscle. And I think this message should go to everyone, and they should be concerned which patient is to go for primary PCI and which patient is to go for thrombolytic therapy. And one of the other contraindications for thrombolytic therapy is also when a patient is contraindicated to thrombolytic therapy. Now, so far as injury is concerned, I think it's a very nice concept given by Dr. Ravi Kasliwal. It was a very brilliant talk. And he's shown his own data. The most impressive thing which I find in Dr. Ravi Kasliwal's talk was his own data of 30 cases. And he's shown very rightly that there are so many factors responsible for myocardial injury. There may be microvessel injury, there may be macrovessel injury, there may be small thrombi, there can be large thrombi, there is a cytokine storm, there can be so-called stress cardiac disease, what they known as Tokusubo syndrome. I think is very nice presentation. And the second thing which he highlighted, which is of a great relevance today, is GLS. And he correlated GLS with tropi. And he said higher levels of tropi and the lower levels of GLS go together. There is a total concordance responsible for myocardial injury. And third important point, which Ravi has highlighted very well, was post-COVID sequelae. I think this is very important. We need more data on this because a lot of patients, they don't know what has happened to them after the recovery. Some of them, he mentioned palpitation is a very, very common manifestation. I think it was a very, very brilliant talk. And I really want to convey and express my gratitude and thanks to both the speakers. But if there are any questions to this, myocardial injury is a new concept. And the GLS, I think the data is very limited. I'm sure, Manish, you agree with me that the data of GLS in the era of COVID, Ravi, we'd like to have your comment on this. The global data is also limited and the Indian data is also limited. We'd like to have your comment on this.
No, true. I think this data is emerging. What is happening is that manifestly ejection fraction has problems. We know that. However, it's not a given up technique. Global longitudinal strain is helping us not only in this field, but in many related fields. What is type 2 MI? Type 2 MI is in its basic form a mismatch between demand and supply. So I'm taking it from that level that there is hypoxia and tachycardia simply, and that is causing injury to the myocardium, as happens in sepsis, as happens in tachycardiomyopathies. Same thing is happening here. But what I'm saying is and I don't know the answer yet, that take troponin seriously. If it is elevated, particularly HS troponin, take it seriously, keep it with the patient's data, and then maybe it will help you later on in following them up with echocardiograms and GLS, because there is seems to be a direct relationship that those who have higher troponins also have, but fatty data is very, very minimal to actually come to that conclusion. But with so many people who are listening and stalwarts like you sitting there, it could be easy to get 100, 200 such patients, because this is going to be with us for a while. But it will help us in understanding type 2 myocardial infarction in many other situations, and telling people that, yeah, these guys will come back with heart failure sooner or later, but this is our time to help them out. So that's why. And
So, ladies and gentlemen, I think the message is very clear by both the speakers.
And Dr. Bansal in our institute. Yes, please.
I think the message is very clear by both the speakers. The time has come that there is a paradigm shift. And I'll request both Ravi as well as Manish to create their own apps. And that is the only way digitally we can educate people. That when you have symptoms, don't stay at home. Please come to the hospital. The mortality rate is very high.
Yeah.
When you're being managed at home or you ignore it. That's a very important message. Ravi was a part of this program when we launched for the first time in March 2019, Mission Attack Heart Attack. I think we need to enhance it so that the public is aware of and public knows it. And a very nice mention by Ravi is about the sequelae, and they have to understand. Once we understand it, I'm sure we will be able to cope up with the myocardial injury created by the coronavirus. And I think this is a new entity, and it was a very, very nice experience. Their own data. The best thing I like is their own data. And I'm sure Ravi as well as Manish has covered the global data where we exist in it, showed a very nice study from China as to what has happened there and how it dipped. The way it is shown, there was a dipping of the MI and exact thrombolytic therapy and how the mortality was risen. I think very, very nicely shown. It was a very, very educative talk. And I really want to compliment both the speakers from the core of my heart for the wonderful presentation. We can give a big hand to them. That's it. I can do that. That's the biggest hand I can give them. I don't know how many of us are seeing us, but this was a brilliant talk. We need a lot of data. I just had a yesterday cardiac prevent conference where the topic given to me was same pharmacology approach, but the data was very limited. And the original study, which are presented here by Ravi, was not presented anywhere. One data was shown today by Zakaria from Kerala, but I think the way we have shown the GLS data and troponin relationship, I think that was not discussed. This was something new, and I think we need to do more work on it. With these few words, I express my gratitude and thanks to each and every one of you who are listening to both Ravi and Manish. And I'm sure in the years to come, Ravi has a plan to bring number of series of this program. This was the first of its series, and I'm sure gradually will announce us for the future series also. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to be with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much to be a part of this program. I and Dr. Manish, thank you from the depth of our heart that you were there for our first meeting. And I can tell my voice, wherever it is reaching, that this is the first one. The second webinar will be announced much before in time, and we will have scintillating topics as we had today. Thank you, Dr. Manish, Dr. Chopra. Thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's listening in. Thanks a lot to all of you.
There are a few questions also from the participants, if we have time to take them.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. So, sir, one of the participants has asked if the patient is already on ACE inhibitor or ARB, should we continue it or some changes required in view as COVID-19 also binds to ACE receptors? I can answer this question by saying
Manish,
ACE2 enzyme not only serves as a binding site for this virus, but it also has many beneficial properties. It converts angiotensin 2 into angiotensin 2 to 7, which has anti-inflammatory activities vasodilatory activities, it actually acts exactly opposite to angiotensin. Therefore, increased expression of ACE2 is beneficial to body. And therefore, studies have shown that even during COVID-19, continuing ACE inhibitor ARB is not associated with worse outcome. Rather, these agents reduce lung injury. So we should continue these agents. And in fact, some guidelines recommend that if you want to start these agents afresh in a patient
Do
because
that.
of alveolar systolic dysphagia, you should not be worried about the consequences of causing more infection. So in short, they should be continued because they are beneficial.
Absolutely.
So another question is there any experience of remdesivir causing bradycardia?
Remdesivir, we have been using extensively in our hospital. The patients who are having a occult or overt CKD are more likely to have a complication like bradycardia. So we are very, very judicious. We go by the opinion of the nephrologist, and if he sees the potassium levels are slightly high, or there is a prolongation of the QT interval, or there is a myocardial injury as expressed by Ravi, we have to be very, very careful in using remdesivir. CKD is a very, very important part which we consider. Whenever I talk to our pulmonologist colleague, they also say the same thing, that we should be a little careful in elderly patients or those who are diabetics and those who have an underlying occult or overt CKD, or if their EGFR is less than 30 or 40, we should be very, very careful. Even for giving the NOAC, we have to be rather very, very careful in these patients. So I think this is what we follow, but we have very limited data. Though we use extensively more than 150 patients or 180 patients of COVID, we use remdesivir, and few patients we use plasma therapy, and other therapy we are using steroids and all. But I think remdesivir, this was the main limitation which we had in the setting of CKD.
Also, sir, bradycardia is a complication of COVID-19 infection itself. So in many of these patients, bradycardia can occur because of the infection itself.
Absolutely.
Sir, I think the next question, Dr. Kasliwal will be the best person to answer. Did the recovered patients at Medanta undergo cardiac MRI to look for persistent myocardial edema and LGE?
Yeah, no, we are just planning that study, but right now there are no large number of patients who have actually had an MRI, cardiac MRI done, myocardial MRI done. So I'm not very sure of that. But definitely, Dr. Chopra, I and Dr. Manish have decided that as many patients as we can, in a stratified manner, as we can do a global longitudinal strain, we will do it. Because there are certain times problems of asking people to actually have an MRI who are otherwise well. So there is challenge there.
Is there any study to show benefits from thrombolysis in COVID thrombotic complications? So I believe, sir, in pulmonary embolism, thrombolysis is the recommended treatment, and we go, as I showed for MI also, the guidelines are same, and we need to use thrombolysis.
I just like to quote one example. It's a very interesting question. I had a chartered accountant here who was just 32-year-old, who had both stroke and MI together. 32-year-old, little obese person with a comorbidity. When he came here, we had no option. He was just given thrombolytic therapy and both recovered. He's gone home.
Oh,
we'll follow it up from recovery point of view, because as Ravi pointed out, there are so many sequelae, but the patient was here. I think this was in first 2 months of COVID, and he recovered simultaneously, occurred both, because it's a pro-inflammatory, as mentioned by both the speakers, and pro-thrombotic. Patient may have DVT, they have pulmonary embolism, they can get thrombosis anywhere. So thrombolytic is not going to cause harm. As mentioned by Ravi, Manish, I think I remember, they get DIC, but in DIC, the platelet count is not low here. So the tendency of bleeding is less, I think, as compared to conventionally when we give it to patients. So I think up till now, I think we have limited data. Thrombolytic therapy is tolerated well, especially in the setting of pulmonary embolism and DVT. And the patient who had a stroke, I think I have a limited experience, but we need more data to show the authenticity of thrombolytic therapy in a double stroke, what I just explained to you. But it's a good drug. We wrote in JAMA a consensus study. Myself, Dr. Wander, MS Hiramat, and I think Srinivas Kumar, he was there along with other people. And we have given a very clear consensus that whatever data we have, limited data, the consensus is primary PCI is a therapeutic of choice in large anterior wall MI, cardiogenic shock, tachyarrhythmias, where thrombolytic are contraindicated, or in a patient who has got a myocardial injury with a very high troponin levels, and we mentioned that D-dimer levels are very high. But primary thrombolytic therapy is a drug of first choice where there is no large MI. It's not inferior wall MI. We find thrombus burden is more, or there is a smoker. I think where we must give it thrombolytic therapy with great confidence, and especially in the periphery, where people take so much time to reach, and they are reaching in a time of 120 minutes, which is the golden hour. We should give them and do a rescue angioplasty if required, or after 24 hours, once we have the COVID report, and we are very confident, we can subject our patient for PCI. Every patient has to undergo PCI. But the only question is how to salvage the myocardium in a setting of COVID time.
I think Dr. Chopra, Dr. Bansal, I think we've had a fantastic session. And as a first session of Medanta Echo Cardiology today and tomorrow, entering into a new era, people have been telling me and Dr. Bansal, please, why don't you start this? So finally, we took the plunge. Thank you very much for your time, for your conscience, and for educating us, Dr. Chopra. We always learn from you and Dr. Bansal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
all have a good evening. Thank you.
Here that those of you who have some questions which remain unanswered, you can send an email to Dr. Kasliwal, and we would like to connect with you and reply to your queries.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a good way of doing it.
So,